Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Winsome Jackson. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department, also chair of the New Legacy Committee, and also currently chair of the Political Science Department. Welcome to our 9th annual C.C.H.E.S.S Higher Education Speaker Series at Sierra College. This year's event is sponsored by the Associated Students of Sierra College, La Semana Latina Foundation Committee, and the Division of Student Equity and Student Engagement Centers. It is also supported by numerous clubs and foundations that are listed in your program. There are so many of them that it would take too much time to go down the list, but it's important that we recognize the supporters of this event. As chairperson of the New Legacy Committee, I welcome you to a very unique opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on a relevant topic: social media, destroying or saving democracy. At this point, I would like to recognize our organizers of today's event for their dedication and incredible accomplishment in bringing this event to our campus. Please stand and remain standing as I call your names. Dr. Matt Archer, Professor of Anthropology and co-chair of the New Legacy Committee. Ralph de Unamuno, Professor of History. Sandy Escobar, Professor and Chair of Art and Creative Metal Design. Thomas Evangelista, co-founder of California Dreamers. Jay Hester, Department Chair and Professor of History. Andre Mendoza, Faculty Coordinator of the Learning Center. Wayne Robinson, Counselor and Coordinator of our Black Excellence Program. So let's thank all of our supporters and organizers. Yeah. I would also like to recognize Wendy Crawford, one of our Sierra College part-time Spanish faculty and dual enrollment teacher at Rocklin High School, for bringing her high school students to the event. So if Wendy's here, we'd like to recognize her. Thank you for your hard work. That's much appreciated. Before I invite Dr. Ortega to the stage, it's important that we take care of some housekeeping events. So please note that the meet and greet that's on your program from 3 to 5 p.m. is canceled due to scheduling issues. Also, in the unlikely event of an emergency, it's important that you know how to exit the theater. So to my left and to my right, there are exits. Directly behind you, there are also exits. Restrooms are located in the lobby, so if you exit the stage behind you to the left, the restrooms are located there. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ortega to the stage, who will introduce our moderator, and our moderator who will introduce our panelists. So, welcome, Dr. Ortega.
Buenas tardes. How's everybody doing today? Pretty good? You ready for an exciting speaker series this year? All right. Thank you, Winsome. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I know you're here somewhere. It's kind of bright up this way. Were you? Oh, there you Okay, I heard you. Let me just introduce myself. I've been at Sierra College for many years, I'll just say. I'm a counselor here. I'm very fortunate to also teach a history class. About ready to teach a social science class. We start in fall of 19 as well. So I really enjoy having students, faculty, and staff here to take advantage, if you will, of the resources that we have here in the areas of expertise that we're about ready to share with you. We literally have persons that have traveled across the country today all the way from, as you see with your program, all the way from Massachusetts, from University of Louisville, from Texas, University of Texas in San Antonio, and also from the State University of New York in Buffalo. So our panelists that we have here today literally have traveled across the country, not only to share their areas of expertise with you regarding a subject I think that is very, very true to all of us with respect to social media and how social media may impact us not only as individuals, but as a society and definitely as a nation with respect to democracy. So I think, and I hope all of you are really looking forward to hearing what they have to share with you. On a personal level, let me just say that like so many millions of others, I had the opportunity in my life to support, serve, and protect the life of C.S.H.E.S.S. We know him today as a leader who gave his life to carve out a path of social justice. Along with Dolores Huerta, his purpose in life was based upon a doctrine of nonviolence, ya basta, the art of negotiation, the skill of compromise, and the strength of effective communication and mutual respect. Without a doubt, lessons for all of us to learn, to participate, and to incorporate within each of us in each of our lives. Our annual C.S.H.E.S.S. Higher Education Speaker Series upholds these principles as we each year bring to you an opportunity to navigate through the most complex of issues that face our nation. On behalf of Sierra College and the C.S.H.E.S.S Foundation, I also welcome you here today. My privilege is to introduce our moderator for today's event, a colleague who will help us understand the complex issue of social media and its influence upon the principles of democracy within the United States. Marcos Breton is a news columnist and author with the Sacramento Bee, where his editorials are read around the world. He has been with the Bee for more than 20 years and is well known for writing editorial news articles and incites readers to think critically, laugh, become angry, or see an issue in a different way. Please join me as I welcome to our stage, as this year's moderator for the 9th annual C.S.H.E.S.S Higher Education Speaker Series, Mr. Marcos Breton.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be back on the campus of Sierra College. I was here 2 years ago. We had a very interesting panel. We called it Do All Lives Matter? And we had some law enforcement people here and some activists, and it became 90 minutes on police brutality. And that discussion actually was quite prescient considering the times that we're in now. So since this particular session focuses on social media, I'm going to do two things right now. I'm going to take a picture of my big old head here. And now we're going to do a selfie. Everybody, say cheese. All right. Thank you very much. So it's my honor to introduce a distinguished panel, so let's begin. Dr. Brian Gervais, please come make your way to the stage, please. Dr. Gervais is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Geography and coordinator of the Digital Politics Studio at the University of Texas in San Antonio. Don't mess with Texas. His areas of specialization are political communication and political psychology. Dr. Gervais earned his PhD in government and politics at the University of Maryland. His work focuses on the effects of exposure of political incivility and the connection between uncivil discourse and anti-deliberative attitudes. He is also the author of Reactionary Republicanism, let me not butcher that, Reactionary Republicanism, How the Tea Party in the House Paved the Way for Trump's Victory. Please welcome Dr. Gervais. Our next distinguished panelist is Dr. Monica Stevens. Dr. Stevens is an associate professor of geography at the University of Buffalo. Her areas of research are incivility and social media, as well as the role of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms in spreading misinformation, such as fake news. Her research aims to understand the scope of the problem as well as ways to combat it. Dr. Stevens earned her undergraduate degree in geography and international studies at Clark University in Massachusetts and her master's degree and doctorate in geography at the University of Arizona. And her research, this is very interesting, her research includes the digital divides, who contributes to the internet forums such as Wikipedia and Flickr, and why there are disparities in gender and other characteristics. Please welcome Dr. Stevens. Our next panelist is Dr. Jason Gaines. Dr. Gaines is a professor of political science at the University of Louisville and a fellow at the Brandeis University Educational Network for Active Civic Transformation. Dr. Gaines received a BA magna cum laude in political science from Florida Atlantic University, his MA from the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida, and his PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida. His research primarily focuses on the intersection of information and technology and the psychology of political perception. Please welcome Dr. Gaines. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Adam Berinsky. Dr. Berinsky is a Mitsu Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he serves as the director of the MIT Political Experiments Research Lab. Dr. Berinsky received his BA from Wesleyan University and his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is a specialist in the fields of political behavior and public opinion, and his research examines the continuing power of group-based stereotypes and the effect of voting reforms, the power of the media, public opinion, and foreign policy. Please welcome our distinguished panelists. And I'm not feeling insecure at all about my, my very humble BA in journalism from San Jose State University. Class of 1986. Let's begin, because I have to tell you, panelists, as a journalist of 30 years, one who has seen the change from the time when my industry was coining it, when we controlled the distribution, the platform, the advertising, to now where we control nothing, and where I routinely, every day, see people mistake what I write for some flim-flam piece of garbage on Facebook. And I can't even begin to tell you how frustrating that is to someone who has dedicated his life to journalism and the First Amendment. Let's begin in a historical context. Haven't some of these elements been present in our politics always? I mean, for example, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, there was a whole section about the polemicists of those age and the political attacks and the personal attacks and the birth of a two-party political system. Haven't some of these characteristics always been with us? And if so, how is this time different? And any and all of you can please jump in.
I think that's right. And there's an argument to be made that it's actually the previous news media era, the one that you were just talking about, that's the aberration, right? In the mid-19th century, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, we get the first nationalized newspapers for the first time. And then we move into the 20th century and we get broadcast media. And we have we have professionalized journalism for the first time during the progressive era in the 20th century, right? With Columbia School of Journalism, it's the first professional journalism school in the world. And so it's really only during the 20th century, right, do we really see very, very restricted top-down information flows with a few gatekeepers at the tops in terms of editors and producers and the journalists themselves. And there's an argument to be made that in the social media era, right, in the era of the internet, we are reverting back to the way things used to be prior to the 18th century, where you had pamphleteers disseminating information who didn't have any professional training or weren't, professionals in any sense, didn't have any special characteristics. You had coffee houses of 16th and 17th century London, where people showed up and communicated, and that's how information flowed. But again, it wasn't professional. It wasn't a top-down flow. Now, certainly there's some things that are different about today, right? Where you might have been able to talk in a coffee house in 17th century London and, didn't have to have any sort of professional credentials. But the number of people you were going to influence, a number of people that were going to hear your message was probably pretty small. Today, any of us has the power and ability to go viral, to have our messages, the opinions that we hold, seen by hundreds, if not thousands of people around the world.
So you're telling me I was born 100 years too late? So, Dr. Stevens, what about that? You've studied incivility. Is the incivility that we're seeing online now, is it different from what we have seen or more corrosive? If you put it in context for us.
Well, not particularly. Just to add on to what you just said, misinformation and misuse of communication mechanisms happens in large every time there's a shift in what the new mechanism is. So the invention of the printing press led to a lot of misinformation being produced in print, including like stories of the mystic and the really sort of fantasy ideas, but they were also taken as fact. So similar to as this sort of shift happened towards social media as a new mechanism of person-to-person communication, we started to see, again, like the sort of return to like the dissemination of misinformation, the dissemination of incivil information. The printing press enabled sort of very, very rude information to be widely distributed in the same way that social media allowed rude and incivil information to be widely distributed.
Doctor, you wrote tweeting to power. Did Donald Trump use Twitter to get elected?
Sure. And for me too, I'll be right up front. I'm not a big Trump supporter.
Neither am I.
But that said, he's been great for my citation count. So I had no idea that he was coming right around the corner, and sort of to build on the idea that we're in a different world now. Yes, I totally agree that the aberration was sort of the 20th century journalistic model, professional journalism, and that across the course of our history, that said, it had a pretty good run. Yeah. And you mentioned this, two things that I would say that are entirely different. First off, yes, the ability to reach instantaneously a mass of people where you can go viral, and it's not just that. I think that the coffee shop, the pub that people are in is much larger now. The virtual pub that they're in. So even for them, even the people who aren't going viral are reaching a larger group of their friends, and with maybe sharing fake news, maybe sharing their own opinions, maybe passing on biased news that's not fake. Yeah. The other point is, I think what differs from the sort of old media norms is, and I think both of you have sort of mentioned the control and the gatekeeping power, is that I think, and this is one of the central arguments of tweeting to power, is that where some of that authority has shifted is to politicians. All right, so now what politicians can do is serve the gatekeeping role themselves. And so then they serve as a curator for which news they want consumers to be exposed to. And I can tell you, being from Kentucky, our governor is a master of this, and our governor has come out and told people explicitly that they do not need to read what I would call real journalism, that everything they need to know about Kentucky government and what's going on, they can get from his Twitter feed, which it consists of a bunch of YouTube videos that are completely one-sided, short-sighted, and with the sole intent of painting his administration and his choices in the most positive light. And the problem is that we have a consumer who then it's not just on the elite. We have a consumer who is completely open to that flow of information, because then they get to consume news that reinforces their predispositions. They don't have to have any cognitive dissonance. They don't have to experience the negative emotion that would come with being exposed to ideas counter to their own, and then everybody's happy.
So I want to get Dr. Berinsky into this, where you wrote a book called In Time of War, Understanding Public Opinion from World War II to Iraq. So here's my bias as a journalist, where there are times where I feel that public opinion can easily be shaped or misshaped by the wrong forces. And that is colored by my negative feelings toward Facebook and Google in particular, and what they have done to my industry. But I wonder if you can put it in context for us in terms of how, because we tend to particularly focus on the World War II era in a very nostalgic terms, but public opinion was able to be manipulated at that time, right? I mean, in this state, in California, we interned Japanese Americans on the basis of their race and on the basis of public hysteria after Pearl Harbor. So maybe in that sense, what we're seeing now isn't all that new.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I talk about public opinion with my students, I use as a starting point the fact that if you're a person taking a political science class, or if you're a student coming to a lecture about social media, chances are you're a lot more engaged with politics than the average person, right? That you care about it, and you need to think about what is the average person thinking about when they think about public opinion. And we find is most of the people, most of the time, don't care about politics. And so, there's a lot of talk about these filter bubbles and kind of driving people into these sort of polarized wedges. I think most people, if given the chance, would choose not to engage with politics. So thinking about sort of the point made about the information structure of television mid-century. I'm old enough to remember when there really were only like 3.5 networks. Yeah, sometimes my parents made me watch PBS, but like in today's society, sort of like, I saw the rise of cable, and with that you get more people who can opt out of the news network. So Marcus Pryor is a political scientist who's done some great work on this, but basically, it was a time not just that was unusual for the press, but in entertainment more generally, right? And once you can select out of following the media, if you want to watch ESPN or if you want to watch game shows, you can find that yourself. And so the problem, though, is that in a situation where most of the people opt out, then you can be influenced when things sort of go slow. So thinking about 9/11, kind of how folks got swept up in that, the Iraq War, was that because people were actively taking that in, or is there sort of something in the air? And so in that war book, I talk a lot about that, how it's sort of if all the political parties are on board, so something like as you mentioned, the Japanese internment during World War II, that people can be led to support horrible things, not because they're horrible people, but they're people who basically outsource the information to their political leaders.
So I know the older folks do, but the students, do you know who Walter Cronkite was? Okay, Walter Cronkite was the anchor of the CBS Evening News from right after World War II until the early 80s, and he was known as the most respected, trusted man in America, that if he said it, it had to be true. So often I have readers, older readers, throw at me, it was so much better when Walter Cronkite my response is always, Walter Cronkite wouldn't last 5 minutes now. And I'm remembering the day that Michael Jackson died, and TMZ had it before the legacy media, where we were playing by these rules to where we don't announce someone's dead until a coroner confirms it, and TMZ doesn't play by those rules, and they pay for information. And so, and I laugh at myself now, where I was the person on Twitter who was admonishing the thousands of people who were tweeting Michael Jackson's death and saying, no, it's not official yet, it really shouldn't be. And I had this vision of myself as the little kid with his finger in the dike where I was already underwater and didn't even realize it. So doesn't this audience and the public have a role to play or have a responsibility then to be more critical in their thinking? And isn't part of this issue a breakdown of civics and our education and a lack of understanding between what journalism is and what propaganda is? And I would invite any of the panelists to go ahead, Dr. Bernstein.
Okay, just add a couple of things to that. I mean, I think that you're putting the onus on people that they need to be sort of more critical thinkers, and there's been a lot of talk in that direction. On the other hand, I think you got to recognize the world for what it is, which is that politics for most people is, I mean, I hate to, like, this is not very inspiring, this line of work, but basically that you can do things to make politics more interesting. And some of that is what you've seen with the Fox News narrative, and we've seen also on MSNBC, that you can make it seem like a fight, like a battle, and get people involved that way. So I think that in many ways it's tricky because journalists are doing what they have an incentive to do, which is to pitch the news in such a way that it makes it easier to get an audience. And so I think that the onus shouldn't necessarily be on the people, right? Because most of the people, most of the time, don't pay attention to politics because they don't find it interesting. Then we need to put the onus, but not just on the journalists, but on political leaders as well.
Well, Dr. Gaines, are we being manipulated, or do we want to be manipulated? Are we happy to be manipulated?
I mean, do we want to be manipulated? No. Are we being manipulated? Sure. I mean, this is not new that opinion leaders try to lead opinion, right? But that said, what I think is sort of the dangerous side of new media is that a lot of the negative implications of it are neither by the design of the producers of the new media or by the users. That they're artifacts of separate goals, right? Like, so I think Facebook, for instance, I don't think that they set out, when we talk about filter bubbles, they didn't set out to create political filter bubbles. They set out to create a product that users would be happy with. And so then they set an algorithm up that responds to that user's behavior to try to make some estimation of what this user wants. And it turns out that most people don't like getting engaged in conflict. They don't like reading news that is uncomfortable, that challenges them. They might not even like reading news at all. Mm-hmm. And so what ends up happening is the people of whom they most interact with, the algorithms pick that up, and if people are more likely to interact with others who share their point of view, then their news feed gets populated with that. Now, so for me, I stay away from politics on Facebook as a political scientist because I have a lot of students who follow me on Facebook, and I really don't want to talk about my own personal politics. My news feed is full of skateboarding because that's what I do. But the issue here is that then what's happening is if people's perception of the world around them is shaped by the information that they have cognitively accessible, and increasingly people are getting the bulk of maybe their political and news information via some kind of social media feed, whether it be Facebook or news aggregators or YouTube, whatever it may be, and if their own psychology is shaping what structures that news feed, then they're being manipulated not by their intent and not necessarily by the intent of the creator of Facebook. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that people who know that, opinion leaders, and understand that, can then use these mediums to try to influence people.
I just wanted to add to that some of the onus needs to lie in the companies that are profiting off of producing and reproducing egregious content that's more likely to go viral if it's sufficiently has a great story, which often fiction it has a much greater story than fact, or if it is particularly hateful content, it's actually more likely to go viral than the benign content that we produce. Like fantasy is more interesting than reality sometimes, and that's when that goes viral, when it gets more click counts, even when people are sharing it because they're angry about it, it ups how often that information is distributed, which is profitable to some companies like TMZ or even to Facebook as well.
Facebook is evil, isn't it?
I don't think it's evil.
Isn't it an evil corporation that takes our information and monkeys around with these algorithms and essentially connects us with other ignorant people who get angry with each other? That's not what they do?
I would say it's a technology that broadly connects people with other people in a way that hasn't been done at this scale.
Yeah, we'll get back to that.
Just to build off the previous point, and specifically something Adam brought up a little bit ago, we often bemoan this idea of infotainment, right? This idea of news that isn't purely news, that has sort of entertainment elements in it, that we want stuff that's more clearly news. We want a concrete wall, a clear division between news and entertainment. But I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. And others have made the case that maybe we should invite more infotainment, right? Adam brought up Marcus Pryor's work a little bit earlier that shows, look, we used to have, way back when, during the broadcast era, huge gaps in knowledge between those who are educated and uneducated, right? In the era we live in now, there is still a knowledge gap, but it's not based on education anymore. It's based on preference for entertainment, right? Those who prefer entertainment, doesn't matter how educated they are, tend to know less about politics than those who prefer news, right? And so the trick is to get some information that includes news, current events, stuff we do want people to know about, stuff that's important to democratic citizenship, right? To draw viewers to that as well. And Diana Mutz, in an excellent book, which I recommend everyone read, called In Your Face Politics, makes the argument that, look, it's fine to have some entertaining aspects to your news, right? If it's drawing people in, if it's informing them to an extent. And she tells us to look at how South Korea runs its elections and look at its elections coverage. And I encourage you, not right now, but later, to Google South Korean election coverage, go to YouTube, and watch those shows. And you won't understand any of it unless you know South Korean, but it's entertaining, really entertaining. You'll see the candidates competing like it's in Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're little like emoji people. And it draws viewers in. South Koreans care about or are entertained by it. They're drawn in, they're learning about their elections, and they're learning about the candidates to an extent.
Well, no wonder we're manipulated. No, seriously. So let's get right to the heart of the topic, is the impact that social media has had on our politics and our democracy. And I would, having been on this campus before, I would guess, and I would guess pretty accurately that a majority of the students sitting before us now have an interest in social justice and have been energized to have their voices heard. But is that process happening in a positive way on social media? Are social justice issues being disseminated, and can people make their voices heard, or are they being drowned out by the trolls and by some of the fake news that we all hear so much about? Any of you can?
I think certainly social media probably helps with a lot of social justice causes. I think there are mobilization efforts. I think there's sharing of information. I think it's a way of recruiting other folks to causes, and just sort of in general, spreading or making people more aware of certain injustices and certain problems we have. Think back, and this isn't necessarily a social justice cause, but think back. People remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, right? Mm-hmm. The Ice Bucket Challenge, right? Which spread awareness, right, about people dealing with, it was MLS, right? I think, yeah, MLS, right?
ALS.
Yeah, ALS. MLS is Major League Soccer.
Major League Soccer.
And so how many people were aware, or became more aware of ALS research and were able to contribute, perhaps give money to that cause and stuff. And that's not a social justice issue, but I do think that's an example of social media actually having a positive impact and spreading awareness of important things.
To add another example, social media fills a gap within rural communities quite often that don't have access to traditional media coverage, like your newspaper. A lot of newspapers have been gutted, a lot of newspapers have become ghost newspapers, a lot of newspapers aren't able to send real journalists into small communities to report on very, very hyper-local issues. And those issues are very important to the people who live there, where national news is very important, but if your community is impacted by the loss of a major employer or maybe an opioid wave, you want to also know what's happening within your block, within your neighborhood, with your immediate neighbors. You want to know what happened down the street and why are there so many police cars there, in a way that the traditional news, especially when the traditional newspaper is located an hour's drive away in much of the country, aren't able to cover issues that are that local. And we need to rely on citizen journalists and community members to document and share that news and information.
I'll take a little more critical position, but with a happy-ish ending. Ish, for sure.
Yeah, because I'm not feeling happy.
Yeah, okay. So look, I think at the end of it, I think social media does a good job of lowering the costs of organization, for the kind of organization necessary for activism, whether it be social justice activism or even some kind of right-wing activism, right? That it lowers those costs because they can reach people, they can organize, they can communicate, they can set things up quickly. That said, I am also fairly confident that an increased reliance on social media, back to the filter bubble argument, that what happens is people are increasingly not being exposed to information counter to their own. And my colleague and I recently did some research where we were able to show that even while holding constant traditional predictors of policy, attitude, extremity, that Americans, the more that they relied on social media to gather information, the more extreme their opinions were across a whole range of policy issues, from economic to social to foreign policy, policies about race, policies about affirmative action, abortion. I could go through the whole thing. Now, we have some difficulty of chicken and egg here, right, of trying to figure out which way the causal direction runs on this. But nonetheless, there's a strong relationship. Now, to the happy-ish ending. What I have, and so if the idea is it saving, hurting democracy, the reality of it is that people who have more extreme opinions are more likely to be politically engaged. And so if the internet and social media in particular is making people become more polarized, those people are becoming more engaged. And so maybe, like if everybody sort of had similar opinions, then we become apathetic because everything's just rolling along. But if you're sitting in these two camps that are far apart from each other, then you're incentivized to try to do something because there are people fighting against the very things that you believe in. And so, I mean, that's sort of now whether or not that ends up with blood or not is, up for debate.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think that kind of what I'm taking from this is that there is no necessarily good or bad. There's technology. So so you can take so I was going to do the reverse. I was going to start with a happy story and then end. Okay. But I'm a New York Jew, and that's how we roll. So it's thinking about this. One thing that's great about the internet and thinking where we started in terms of organization is that it makes it easier for people with like-minded interests to find each other to both organize and spread information, right? And so we can think about cases where that's been leading to things that are a net good. The other thing, though, is that it makes it easier for people to find folks with like-minded interests and spread information. So I spend a lot of time talking to doctors about anti-vaxxer communities, right? And this is something, like it's always been around, right, that there's been skepticism of medicine, of health. But if you look at vaccine rates across the country, that this is something that has gone down over time, especially in high socioeconomic communities. So like where I live in Cambridge, Mass, the schools that have the lowest vaccine rates are the places that have the highest socioeconomic status. It's because they found these communities, lefty folks who are into alternative medicine, they spread information, they organize, and that this is something, but it's not that the internet is good or bad or social media is good or bad. I think all the examples we've given, both good and bad, are that they exacerbate the tendencies that you get when people can find each other and share information.
So you studied public opinion through the Iraq War. Iraq War was before Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah.
And we were manipulated anyway, weren't we?
Yeah, I mean, so I should say, we were kind of laughing as we were talking beforehand. I spent last summer working for Facebook, working on theirs there. So, but I guess that, so, I mean, but I'm not, it's sort of like, they said, well, what are you going to say if it comes up? And sort of, it's come up. But I think that I'm not going to be an apologist for Facebook because I think there are some troubles there. But I think a lot of it is this question about, this is technology. So like, what's the solution to the spread of fake news on Facebook? Right? One thing is like, okay, let's remove fake news, right? But the question is then who gets to decide what is fake news? And you can see this pushback from the conservative community saying, we're getting shut out of Twitter and Facebook. These are left-leaning institutions. They're shutting down our communication. And I think that then you'd be able, basically you're weaponizing that. So, I guess the nice thing about being an academic is I can just think about problems. I don't have to come up with solutions. But so I don't know what the solution is, but I think it is an incredibly difficult problem. I would say in my time working there, the folks on the research side, social scientists who are doing this, everyone knows it's a really hard problem. And I don't think that there is an easy solution.
Well, how about not lining your pockets with Russian ads? And, that would be a good way to start.
Yes, but I mean, that is, when I think about, what is the real problem with, go back to how I pitched before about people being able to find each other, right? Is the problem that these, there's been studies done, Brandon Nyhan has done a lot of work on misinformation. He basically argues like, even if these ads, sort of had an effect, the effect that they would have had to switch the election would have had to been massive. Right, so it's not to say it's not a problem, but for me the bigger problem is thinking about if we're a world in which most people don't want to pay attention to politics, but in their Facebook feed or whatever other social media feed they use, or in the CRN ad, the content recommendation ads at the bottom of news stories, they're getting exposed to incidental information that's bad. For me, that's what's really scary. And so there's some easy solution. I was
going to say, so we have an audience full of students. So how should these students be prepared? I want all of you to answer this. How should the students be prepared to identify and deal with misinformation?
Well, let me say, first of all, I assume that no one here is on Facebook because it's an old person thing, which is why I learned by talking to my students. So, my son is on teenager, Snapchat, Instagram, right? So these are more visual media. So I think it is, thinking about this is basically, I would say, cast a critical eye on, can you believe everything that you see?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain level, I think you have to come informed to the medium in the first place, because without some sense or understanding of what constitutes real journalism, you don't know how to tell the difference, right? And so fake news, for me, it's sort of easier because I have sources that I know are trusted. And so probably what my suggestion would be is to think about the source. Investigate it. Like if you think something sounds a little outlandish, then you can easily Google and find out pretty quickly about whether or not it's fake news, whether or not that source is known for that kind of thing. And so you just have to take some agency in it yourself, I guess.
I think those are both great suggestions. I think that students this age are not part of the problem. They're generally part of the solution in using social media as a way to advocate for your particular causes and connect to people who you know in real life, like the crazy aunt or uncle that keeps posting misinformation. Engage in an actual conversation with them.
Yeah.
Talk to them in person when you see them about, hey, I saw you posted the story. What do you think of that? Where did you get that from?
Yeah.
And just talk to them as human to human and focus on that human connection with the people who you care about, who you might be connecting to digitally, and who might be more vulnerable to this sort of information stream.
And I would echo Monica here. I mean, that's along the lines of what I was going to say, is that the students that are here today aren't part of the problem, that they are the solution. They are armed with skills, including critical thinking, and are able to do a pretty good job, I'm sure, of figuring out what's probably true and what's not, or at least know how to research whether or not something is true or not. With those skills comes some responsibility as well to be opinion leaders, right? To be good citizens, to use social media platforms to correct others when appropriate, right? Maybe not necessarily in a public fashion, but through messaging apps, etc., right? And making sure that you're spreading good information, and when somebody gets something wrong or is spreading a rumor and it's false, right? Send them an article that corrects the record and demonstrates why this is false. And so, we're relying on you in a lot of ways to actually, fix the problem that's you didn't create, but is one that we all have to deal with now.
Yeah, it's on your generation to clean up our mess. Please. So I promised myself that I wouldn't make this a Trump session, but let's just focus quickly because on 2016, and I'm thinking about specifically early in the campaign, traditional media was reporting a great deal about how Hillary Clinton held a huge lead in TV ad buys, and the coverage was almost mocking of Donald Trump at how little he was spending on TV. And unbeknownst to people in my industry, they were putting a great deal of effort into social media. And really activating at a fraction of the cost of what they would have been paying for in television. And so, now that we look back on it, not knowing the full scope of the Mueller report, but how much of a role did social media play in getting this man elected as president of the United States?
I would say it played a role, but perhaps not in the way we think, right? I don't think that Trump's campaign social media strategy was a deciding factor, and that they had this amazing plan, and that they were geniuses for avoiding raising money and advertising in the traditional way. But I do think it had an effect, or to the extent that Trump's rhetoric was useful, and certainly probably helped them. And the place where we heard from Trump the most was on Twitter. And it's hard to imagine that Trump could have gotten his message out as easily as he did if we didn't have Twitter, if we didn't have social media platforms. And so we have to think about how we got here, though, right? I mean, Trump's rhetoric and how effective it was, and how well it was accepted. It didn't just come out of the blue, right? We didn't go from the rhetoric of George W. Bush to Donald Trump instantly, right? There's been a period, from roughly the election of Barack Obama until now, where there was increasing use of incivility among many political elites, and I think that paved the path for Trump in a lot of ways.
Wouldn't that rhetoric have been disqualifying at some point in our nation's history? I kept thinking all the way through, at some point when he's tweeting this ridiculous stuff, it's going to be disqualifying. It was actually the opposite in the minds of a lot of people.
I would argue that he didn't need to have so much media ad buys on traditional TV because the media kept covering his tweets. So the news, the traditional news media, served as a great advertising platform because every day they were discussing what was happening on Trump's Twitter feed, and that was free advertising. They still are, right? Every day, you turn on MSNBC, there's a half-hour discussion about Trump's tweet that he sent at 3 in the morning. So why does he need to buy TV ads when he can get them for free?
Right, and I mean, this is somewhere that social media has changed, and that probably no one has done since social media has done it more effectively than he has at controlling the media agenda. He can turn them on a dime, just like that. All he has to do, is with his 256 characters, turns them right like that. And to your other question of isn't there a point where it's disqualifying, is I think we have to ask ourselves, why wasn't it? Okay? And that says something about public opinion in general and where it's situated with its feelings about DC and its feelings about government in general. And so if the public is open to that kind of rhetoric and to be influenced by that, then there's a precondition. And the precondition is they are extremely disgruntled and dissatisfied with the status quo. And so they hear this and it sounds new and aggressive and it sounds crazy, but for some people, not me, maybe they found it hopeful. And that's horrifying to me that kind of rhetoric would seem hopeful to people, but I'm fairly certain that it does.
I mean, I think also just to point out that, what you said doesn't have anything to do necessarily with social media, right? It's about, so I think that it's important for us, like when I think about the most surprising thing to me about Trump in 2016 was I did not think that we lived in a world where someone could say, I didn't say that. You can roll tape watching them say it. And not even the horrible side, just like stuff where he said, like, I never said that global warming was a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese government. And you roll the tape, and there it is. Like, I did not think that we lived in that world. Right. That has nothing to do with social media. And so I think it's important to think that we got two things going on here. One is about incivility and the loss of expertise. Actually, so we have three things. Those are two things. And then on the other hand, there's how Trump was able to play social media. The fact that he could do those both well doesn't mean that we shouldn't ignore social media, but I'm really interested in, I still don't have an answer for this. Like, I did not think we could live in a world in which this would happen.
I really have, I've thought a lot about this, and I think that the primary reason that we are in a world where he can do that is Fox News. I think that's it. And because I think that they will not report. They won't run that tape. And they don't run it, and there's a whole segment of the public, politically active public, who gets all of their news from that. And so if they sit there and they don't even run it. So if Fox News ran all of those things, we wouldn't be in this world.
Maybe, but it could be that, here's another, the scary thing is that maybe politicians could have done this all along, but showed self-restraint.
Yeah, self-restraint.
Right? Right, sure.
And so this is like, okay, now
the cat's out of the bag.
Exactly. And, are we going to
actually had some shame.
Before. Right. So I don't know. So I'm hesitant to just blame Fox News. But
well, I don't want to.
I mean,
I'm trying to sensationalize it a bit.
It's observationally equivalent to the world in which, sure, I'm sure we're going to get to 2020 soon, but like 2020 could just be, I'm trying to think of all the words that come to mind. I don't want to say into an open mic, right? But this is what 2020 could be. Yeah.
Okay. So on the related topic of that, instability and course, I mean, when it comes from the Oval Office, it does have an effect. And some of you on this panel have studied when elites espouse instability and the impact that it has on the public. And Dr. Stevens, I'm particularly thinking about, as I was researching you the other night, the heat maps that you created that showed where some of the most intolerant tweets were coming from. Can you tell our audience about that work that you've done, and we can we can jump off of that.
Sure. So we harvested about 14, we started with like 25 very negative words that specifically targeted one specific ethnic group or sexuality. We harvested all of these terms, just in a bulk data pull from Twitter, and then mapped out where they were coming from. And I paid students 1 penny per tweet to read through these tweets and determine, is it hostile, is it negative, is it racist, and who is it targeting? Who is this incivil towards? Because that was the issue of like, sometimes the tweets would be like, dykes on bikes, hashtag San Francisco Pride, and you're like, that's not a negative tweet, that's not targeting anybody, but there were other times that term was used in a very negative context. So they did all the manual sentiment analysis, and we looked at where is racist content coming from, based off who is it racist towards, where is homophobic content coming from, and where is ableist content coming from. And we found at the time, and this was before the 2016 presidential election, large clusters of content coming from Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and broadly the rural spaces and Rust Belt states. That was very surprising. And at the time, I received a lot of kickback saying, my community, Iowa, is not this way. And well, yes, but we actually know who that person was. We just didn't release that information publicly.
And you know the significance of the states that she just rattled off,
Yeah.
right? Those are the states that swung the victory of Trump.
Pennsylvania did not.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, Pennsylvania did go for Clinton.
Pennsylvania did go to Trump.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Just the
and
last little bit around Philadelphia.
and the word, so it was race, ethnicity.
And ableism. And that became kind of ironic because this is well before we had ever thought of Trump as a political president. We harvested the data in 2013 and 14, and it was really, the data came from 2011, 12, 13, and 14. So it was well before Trump was a candidate for president that we pulled this data and mapped this data. So ironically, we were also able to see that it just was broadly, we could see in each category, we could see where collective negativity towards that group came from.
Why do you think that, like those states, like why do you think it came from those areas?
I think it was economic change happening. I think that, you know, at that time, you could also see this sort of decline happening in the manufacture and extractive industries coming out of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. You could see sort of this resentment bubbling. And we talked earlier about Catherine Kramer's phenomenal book, The Politics of Resentment, about the rise of Scott Walker in Wisconsin. And that book, she does this great job of actually crossing in and going and talking and sitting at small cafes and small places all throughout Wisconsin with just groups of people and saying, like, what's going on? And what do you think of the urban people? What do you think about politics? And hearing how rural people vocalize their resentment towards the sort of, as they thought of them as centers of power this is just Wisconsin, of Milwaukee and Madison, and how their resentment towards the universities, their resentment towards the sort of elite structures that were existing within the state, and how that manifested in their voting patterns, that Scott Walker did not represent that. Yeah. And we've spoken about this before, but that played out sort of on a national scale. But I was already seeing that happen within this large clusters of social media that we harvested within Wisconsin and within Pennsylvania. And Ohio.
Just very quick, because Kathy's work, so Kathy's a good friend. There's this like misinformation, disinformation circuit we were on last year, but Kathy's work came out, her data collection was at the same time that you were doing and like this was all bubbling under the surface in 2012 plus or minus a few years. I think it's really important to recognize that this is a phenomenon that you can see, both the in-depth going and talking to people, and just Twitter, you can think of listening into conversations that people are talking that same way.
And importantly, I mean, Walker and like-minded brethren fomented this resentment as well, right? It wasn't just there. He wasn't just, didn't take advantage of it. I mean, his rhetoric helped foment it. And I think, that's a key aspect to understanding Trump's power as well, right? Is that there were political elites fomenting the resentment in the years prior, ever since Barack Obama's election, right? The Tea Party movement, in a lot of ways, was designed to foment resentment towards cultural change, demographic change, just change in general, right? I mean, change, hope and change was Barack Obama's campaign slogan, and they took the change and said, well, this change is bad for you. And the undeserving folks are coming and they're getting way more than you are, and you're not getting your fair share here. And it wasn't just rural folks. I think it was just, this sort of white grief and more generally. And I did a study with a colleague, Erwin Morris, and we looked at, we collected all the tweets made by members, Republican members of Congress during a 4-year period. And we coded them for a variety of different sentiment, angry rhetoric, sad rhetoric, and also incivility as well. And what we found was that folks in 2016 who had been represented by a member of Congress that had a lot of sad rhetoric and a lot of uncivil rhetoric were much more likely to vote for Trump. Now, something of a chicken and egg here, right? Scenario here where, well, maybe these people already have the sentiment to an extent, so they're electing people like this, and then, of course, they're going to elect Trump as well. But I do think the role of the rhetoric by these members of Congress, right, during this 4-year period of reminding people that this was an America in decline, that this was a country that was failing, that this country had failed them, that the federal government had failed them, and that other people were benefiting from this, people not like you who didn't deserve it, that this had some role in creating the conditions that made Trump's rise possible in 2016.
Well, this rise that you refer to, I often see it referred to in the media sometimes as like the last gasp of a certain era, but I'm not quite so sure that's true, right? I mean, it's that there are that some of the incivility and hostility was coming from younger generations as well, which is to say that it's still. There's still very much a chance that we're not at the end of something, but right in the middle or beginning of something. Based on your work, do you feel more or less hopeful about the future that some of the hostility that Trump played on is that a generational thing that's going to go away, or is that too simplistic?
I'll give my hopeful pitch here. I think young people now across, because look, like where I think a lot of the divide that we see, it's an urban-rural divide. I think so much of what we see can be predicted by that. I mean, whether or not that's causal, but there's a correlation between these separate sort of polarized camps. And because of a lot of the incivility seems group directed, right? It's brown people, it's the rapists and drug addicts and drug dealers, and so it's being pointed at people. And that's where the incivility comes from, and it's not necessarily ideological. It's more in-group, out-group, right? And so back to the young people, I see this from my students, I see this from my daughter, I see this from, and if I think about what kind of the shared popular media that people are consuming, from movies to Netflix to television shows, is that all of this is creating a world that young people are much more accepting of diversity than a lot of their seniors are. And so I think that as we move forward, that some of the vitriol and hate that we see now will diminish, because young people, as they become adults, don't see the world that way to the same degree. Now, there's still going to be, I mean, there will always be us versus them I mean, I think it's part of the human condition, is that we find our identity in who we are and what in groups, and we think of ourselves that way. And if it's not race, it'll be attached and detached earlobes. It'll be we will find something. That said, so check, and everybody checks.
We're on the
and so I'm hopeful that young people are going to take us past, because maybe the sort of in-group, out-group thing is more acceptable depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking about people with different ideas versus sort of immutable characteristics. And I don't know, but I have hope.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the positives of social media, is that us versus them isn't necessarily a geographic phenomena. That us can refer to a class of people or a group that's unified across distance, whereas previously, when you talked about us, it had to be us, of the people who I know, the people who are spatially bound within my city, within my community, within my neighborhood, and now you can have a community that extends regardless across different communities, where people who are minorities of very different types, who maybe are facing the same disease or facing the same critical concept, can unite in using social media as a tool to build community.
And I also think, as social media changes, how comfortable we are being uncivil and very vitriolic to one another might change as well. It's always hard to predict, but we could believe that social media is becoming more visually oriented, right? You look at platforms like Snapchat, right? Snapchat is looking at other people, right? Looking at other people's faces. And we have to think that reminds folks that there's another person on the other side of that platform communicating on another computer or another phone. And that's a lot different than text-based communication, where we can very quickly forget that we're talking to another person and talking about another type of person. So as social media becomes more visually oriented and is a lot more video and communicating, sort of a video conference style, maybe in a lot of ways that replicates how we communicate face-to-face, right? We're looking at someone's face, we're seeing their facial reactions, we're seeing their body language, and that we'll be more hesitant to say really nasty, mean things to them when we're communicating that way. Just in the same way we're hesitant to say very uncivil, mean things to people when we're talking to them face-to-face.
I guess that I have a less optimistic take, and I really hesitate to go there. So maybe we should leave it at that and on to the next topic.
Well,
okay. Well, I guess that all these arguments. So like the arc of history bends towards good. I was born in 1970. I grew up in New York City at a time that was very diverse, and sort of that I was of the first generation, sort of post-civil rights, that we're all going to get along, and just like it's it just makes me I worry about you've heard these arguments, so I wanna think this, but I'm just like
I keep seeing media commentators talk about describing Trump and Trumpism as a last gasp, and I would love to believe that. And I'm not trying to be negative. It's just I'm just really curious.
Well, let me say it's one thing that I've done some work on how do we measure racial attitudes and racial appeals. And so there was a book by a former colleague of mine, Tali Mendelberg, that was very heavily focused on the fact that there used to be blatant racial appeals in American history. So you go back to the Reconstruction era, like through the 60s, just horrible imagery. And that she talked about how in the modern age, and she's writing this in the mid-90s, that this has gone away, that it's only latent kind of appeals, that there are things like, I remember, but Jesse Helms had a crumpled black hand, right? Sort of like you weren't going to use it, you weren't going to have something that wasn't subtle. And so Tali said that these subtle things work, but if you call them out and say like, hey, that's racist, that doesn't work anymore, right? Yeah. So that's the happy story. Now, recently, a bunch of scholars have gone back to see like, is there a difference between these implicit, sort of subtle appeals and explicit appeals? And what they found is, explicit appeals are working really well today, right? And so, I mean, this is what gets me worried, that just thinking empirically, I guess this is why I didn't want to go there, and so I apologize to everyone for getting this.
I mean, it's a great point.
But it's just sort of like, that just in the same way, I never thought we'd have a president who says things that can be counted on video. Like, I thought we were done with these like blatant racial appeals, and clearly we're not. And so like, I guess that I'm, you know, it's,
I
I'm
mean,
a
it
little more
makes-
cautious then.
It makes me wonder, though, like, if, and this, I've been criticized by some of my, a student of mine for this position, is I'm like, well, maybe that these blatant racial appeals now are a good thing, because it puts it out in the light. And so we're having conversations like this, and these are happening everywhere in a way that, and I don't know that it makes it a last gasp, but I'll go back to young people. I think that young people don't respond to those appeals in the same way. And I don't have empirical evidence to suggest that, but
I would feel better if they didn't work. I guess if they were just out there, it's like, to me that feels like a last gasp. Is that you're
It's still
trying
working.
this?
Yeah.
And the problem is, and not only is it still working, it wasn't working for a while, and now we're back in a world in which they're working again. And to me, that's really scary going forward.
Yeah, when I was a kid, people thought that Nazis were bad. You know, and all of a sudden, some people don't think they're so bad. You know, and I still think they're bad. That's my story. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. So I want to lose the point because we're coming to the end. I want to bring this in for a landing. But so we are now in. You could say we are now in the 2020 cycle. Okay, we're in it, even though some of us don't want to pretend like we're not. We're in it now, and Beto O'Rourke announced his candidacy this morning. I'm still trying to figure him out a little bit, but okay, that's a whole other thing. But so is 2020? Let's make a prediction. Obviously, predictions are what they are, but is 2020 going to be different from 2016? Is there going to be a course correction? Not only in social media, but in traditional media, with the way that Trump is covered and with the way the election is covered. Are we still going to be in these false equivalencies that sort of rule the day in 2016, or do you think it's going to be different?
I'd say that I think that one thing that I think to remember is I was listening to an audiobook of How Democracies Die, which is a really great book written by political scientists. And it's one thing that I took away from that is that, you know, in the end, once Trump got the nomination, he was a normal Republican. Normal Republicans embraced him, and then it becomes an election of a Democrat versus a Republican. And given where we are, you know, everyone's talking about that, we're in a very divided society, and if you have an election that's just a Democrat versus a Republican, then anything could happen. And I think people in 2016, you know, like I grew up, as I said, in New York City, watching Donald Trump my whole life. I was just thinking, like, how could he possibly win? Like, so Donald Trump as a person, maybe not. But when Donald Trump is the Republican candidate, then he has a good chance. And I think looking forward to 2020, it looks like he will be the Republican candidate. So I think I was, you know, brace for a close election, just because things are locked in.
Yeah, I think, like, if I were going to bet on the outcome, I would bet against Trump, but I think the odds are, you know, I think he has less of a chance now than he did then, is why I would say go that way. That said, I think it could go either way. Now, as far as how predicting the way the media is going to handle it, they're going to keep doing the same thing. That's really simple because it's just a numbers game. They are getting ratings. And so I think Donald Trump has been good for that, and they're not going to change.
I agree that the media is going to do the same thing, and they're going for ratings, and they're going for click counts and that sort of thing. I think that the one difference is that there is a broad awareness across society, and even within kind of more Republican or right-wing leaning groups, that fake news is a thing. Whether you're reading it and believing it or not, you'll even see within these sort of right-wing forums people commenting that with their own criticism and skepticism of the news. So I think that's the only, I mean, whether they're applying it correctly or not is not true, but I think that most everybody in the country now has at least heard of fake news and thought critically about the role of social media in that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, maybe voters are a little bit different this year with how they utilize social media, or rather in 2020, how they utilize social media, what news sources they go to, and maybe part of the reason why Donald Trump got elected was some apathy, some belief that it could not happen, it absolutely could not happen. Clinton was going to win, she's guaranteed to win, and maybe that's a different case in 2020 where nothing's taken for granted and there's going to be more energy, especially towards the end of the campaign.
So just in the few moments that we have left, I want to get your feeling about a couple of social media phenomenons that have taken place. And they involve two different sets of individuals. And the first one is someone who I had never heard of before, based on my age, but Jussie Smollett. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we all know the story, right? All right, so the story, it comes out on social media and then on traditional media that the individual was mugged and was targeted.
Yeah.
Some very important people tweeted instantly, including Kamala Harris, who's running for the presidency.
Yeah.
And then we come to find that at least the police authorities in Chicago have a different take on what happened to the individual. Just as people who have studied social media, if you can each give me your what does that incident say about social media and about us?
Wow. Yeah, wow. I mean, I don't really know. Like, this story to me was just one of those sort of shockers. And I don't know what
But I mean,
I can really take from it other than.
But people, very significant people, jumped
Yeah.
on it immediately
Yes.
in absence of facts.
Sure.
And I have to say, not that but just the old cop reporter in me, like, I held off because I'm like, I want to know a little bit more.
You're waiting for the coroner's report.
Yeah, yeah.
But apparently they didn't get the memo that they should wait for the coroner's report. Right. And so, I mean, that's an interesting angle to think about this, and lens to think of it, is that people now have a venue where they can react quickly and it come back and bite them. That said, if you're not going to be bitten by that if you're not bitten by lying and then saying one thing and then lying about saying it. So
yeah.
I mean, I think another, and so like when I probably, sort of, again, to date myself, but here's a name that probably won't mean anything to is Tawana Brawley, which was in New York City in the late 80s. It was a similar case. It was a girl who said that she had been raped by a group of white men. Al Sharpton was sort of there. And then a lot of people jumped in. So this is nothing new, I guess, in social media, is my first instinct. On the other hand, then you said, right, Kamala Harris jumped in. Yeah. It's like, well, I don't remember anyone of that stature jumping in back then. So I think that there is something about the information. Yeah. But I mean, that's a lot of just sort of taking back to the immediacy of the information flow. I both love and hate Twitter. I love it because I get this constant stream of information, and I hate it because I can't turn it off. Right? It just keeps it keeps going. I'm thinking about I lived in Boston during 2013, the marathon bombing. And I woke up one morning and there was got this alert saying, "Don't leave your house." So Cambridge was in full lockdown, and so I spent the whole day like ducking down in the house on Twitter, trying to follow that. And that's something that sort of that is both the joy and the hell of Twitter. And I think it's just that people can't resist jumping in.
So the other one I would talk about is there was an interesting where the high school students from Covington Catholic High School surrounded the Native American gentleman, and it became an instant sensation. But then there was a backlash afterwards when sort of a larger stretch of film. Now, to me, I felt like, okay, I saw the longer video, and it didn't really change my opinion of what happened there, but it seemed to change the opinions of a lot of people who felt like that the students were treated badly initially, and whether there was anything to be learned from that experience.
I think a lot of that story can be explained by the fact that how perfectly we had different groups align under two different partisan banners there, right? And there's an argument that partisan identity these days is really a mega identity, that we've sorted, not just ideologically sorted into two camps, but groups to a large extent have sorted into two camps, right? And so when we talk about people from minority groups, including Native Americans, we associate them also with liberals, and we associate them with non-white people, and they all fall under the banner of Democrat and liberal, whereas there we had a white kid from an elite college wearing a Make America Great Again hat, right? So clearly Republican conservative. And when we have those, the clear distinction here between two different types of groups, two different type of people are going to navigate to their two sides, and they're going to interpret that event in whatever way makes it easier, or it reduces cognitive dissonance for them, right? Their group, their side, their identity, right, can't be wrong. And I think that's a lot of what had to do with this story.
So let's finish since we're hoping that people learn something from this to accentuate the positive of the positive trends that you've seen in social media that give you more hope than some of the more negative things that we've discussed here today.
I'll tell you this, most of the stuff we've discussed today has been in the context of the United States. And in recent years, most of my research has been on social media effects in the developing world. And what I've found out, repeatedly again and again and again, is that in contextual environments where the flow of information is largely controlled by the state, social media may be one of the only outlets where opposition, dissidence, and discourse that's centered against the status quo exists. And so it can have a democratizing effect, whether or not that, or at least potential for a democratizing effect in more restrictive environments.
I have a slightly different story. Even within the United States, I've got a paper coming out right now where we looked at anti-vax communities or vaccine-critical communities and pro-vax communities on Twitter, and we found that at the state level, more bills are likely to be introduced that were anti-vaccination if there were more anti-vaxxers in the state. But then we found as they went to committee that they didn't pass, they weren't voted out of committee. That at the state level, the health committee and the education committees actually held a very strong scientific ability to discern between scientific information and egregious misinformation. And they were able to say, it doesn't matter which way this is being supported on social media, we're not voting this out of committee, and it just, every anti-vax measure failed after that. They didn't go to floor vote, and they weren't passed out of floor vote. So the democracy wasn't broken at the state level, is what we determined, that actually it was able to function in a way that it was intended to pass truthful information and scientific rigor along and make legislation in that process.
If this is sort of a final thought, I'll add a little bit of nuance to this, one idea of political incivility being all bad. Adam mentioned Tali Mendelberg's work a little bit earlier, and I think that's a case where we talk about some label, some name such as racist, right, which we might say is an example of uncivil talk, calling someone a racist, that actually might have a positive outcome, right, if it leads to some sort of correction and people realize their behavior is normatively bad and they change it. I also think that a good barn-burning speech that might be very vitriolic and attack the other side, right, can be good for mobilizing people and getting people to participate. And so I don't think we want a discourse on social media or elsewhere completely devoid of incivility. I just think we need to recognize that incivility is a strategic tool that can be used for good and bad. And the problem is perhaps when we have too much incivility and that's it, and again, how the people, especially political elites, utilize incivility. What are their end goals?
You think, kind of riffing off that, I guess that I have to say something positive at the end. So
Yeah.
what I will say is I think is that these are tools. The tools are driven by incentives. So earlier on we talked about what are the incentives for the social media companies, right? It's to sell ads, and so that can get subverted. You know, what are the incentives for politicians? They're to fire up their base, right? And so that can get subverted. So I think that recognizing that this is a technology, just a, you know, sort of that incivility is methods of appeal, and trying to figure out how could we kind of push politicians. And this is my big shtick is that we shouldn't blame the people, we should blame the politicians, because I think that that's really the case, is that if you're going to get a solution, it's got to come from the top. And say, in the world in which we live, the incentives are such that it makes sense for politicians to push this way. You know, that Trump could say something, you know, say repeated lies and not pay a price for that, right? Then it's saying like, okay, how can we devise some incentives to push back against that? Because it's the world that we're living in, and we got to figure out how to deal with it.
So last week was Ash Wednesday. I'm a Catholic, and so I decided that I was going to give up nasty tweets for Lent. And I've done that. So I post all my work. I write commentary, strong-worded commentary, so I get reactions, positive and negative. And I have particularly tried to answer incivility with kindness. And I've found that it actually has real power, where you're not always going to change someone's mind, but I definitely have stopped a few people in their tracks. And I will take that. I will take that. And I also would also say it's always inspiring to me to be on this campus and to be in this space. And when I said earlier that it's up to your generation, it really is. And it's up to all of us to be accountable for ourselves and to take the time to be informed, because we see what happens when we're not. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Please thank our distinguished panelists again. And thank you very much.
So on that positive note there at the end, and I'm glad you all ended on at least an upbeat space, I would like to thank our moderator, our panelists, our organizers, our sponsors, supporters, and all of you for being here, and we hope to see you next year.